projector today, because looking at them upside down isn't necessarily the most helpful thing we could do. Looking at them right side up on flashcards is probably more helpful, yeah?
Same thing.
So, let's just kind of run through and talk about what some of these mean, and then I'm going to elaborate on some of them when we get to certain ones. So, this is one of those kind of weird ones. It comes from ancient Chinese. That's the origin of kanji. Everybody knows that? That they're originally from Chinese. And they predate Hiragana and Katakana. If you read your thing about the history of the writing system at the beginning of the textbook, it gives you a little bit of an overview. So this one was, anybody know what this one meant? Battle axe or dagger axe? Yeah. Picture like one of those long spear type things with like a cross piece toward the tip, so that you stab it into somebody and the cross piece stops it from going so far.
Like a pole arm.
Yeah, like a pole arm.
Halberd.
Yeah, halberd, yeah, something along those lines. It's been defined a number of different ways. Different people translate it slightly differently. But it's one of those things that it seems like, well, why do we even need that anymore? Because it's a common component in a bunch of characters. Why? Very likely it has as much to do with pronunciation as anything else. Because that's the thing, a lot of Chinese characters are actually a combination of a part that relates to the meaning of the word in some way, and a second part that relates to the pronunciation. So like, if battle axe was a homophone with some other word, the way they might have created that other word was to put the battle axe piece in the same character with a different word that was pronounced differently, but that had something to do with the meaning. And so the idea was you look at the meaning side for meaning, and you look at the other side for pronunciation. There's a catch, though. That system started out between 5,000 and 2,000 years ago. So how many of those words do you think are actually pronounced the same as they were back then? Not very many.
So it's not. There's no real sounds attributed to it. It's just a concept added on to the sound.
Well, it depends. So let me give you an example of building blocks that actually work in that way, sound component and meaning component. This piece by itself, anyone know what it means? Mouth. Yeah, this one's a mouth. Okay. You add this above the mouth, and you've got to speak or to say. This is a component, but it's also a standalone character. It's the verb to say in Japanese, and it also is a component of a lot of characters having to do with communication. Okay? So words like speak, conversation, essay, language, all kinds of words have this piece to them. Now, adding one more piece. Okay, we've got another mouth down here. And anyone know what that piece is by itself?
5.
Yes, this is the number 5. And 5 is pronounced go, right? The pronunciation is go. Anyone know a word that sounds like go and that is also having to do with communication or speech? Think about go. What word do you already know that's pronounced go and it has to do with communication? Sometimes preceded by nihon or e or chugoku. Go, right? This go means language, as in nihongo, eigo, chugoku go, kangoku go. This is go, this is also go. That's how the classic meaning half, pronunciation half kanji are supposed to work. And if you could take a time machine back to around 500 AD, you would probably find that the vast majority of them actually worked that way back then. It's just, things change. Languages change. Do we still pronounce the GH in night? No. Do we still pronounce the K in knife? No. Does anybody spell knife N-I-F-E? Not really. Right? You're stuck with the old archaic spellings in a lot of cases, even if nobody pronounces it that way anymore. So Japanese is kind of the same way. You're stuck with the kanji as they are, even if the pronunciation no longer matches the so-called pronunciation hint that's part of the kanji. Does that make sense? Okay. So we've got a battle axe, which, like I said, is a common component of a number of characters. We've got this one. Anyone know? An eye, yes, as in what you see with. And this is an example of what they call a pictographic character. The pictogram characters evolved from something that looked a whole lot more like the actual item they were drawing a picture of. Okay, so human eye, right? It's a rough sketch, but it's pretty close to what the ancients actually drew when they first invented the very first characters. This was among the first characters. It was, it's a physical object, so it's easier to draw a picture of it, right? And it's a fairly simple physical object that you can symbolize with just a few lines, and everybody kind of gets what you mean, right? Over time, what happened was the eye kind of moved and morphed into the modern shape that we have today. Okay, so it no longer looks like what they were drawing 5,000 years ago, right? It's actually not that far off from what they were drawing 1,500 years ago. It's actually fairly close to that. There was such a long history in China before writing ever got to Japan. By the time it got to Japan, the writing form that they were using at that point wasn't that different from what we use today. Okay, but that's where we get the character for eye, kanji for eye. And there are a number of other kanji relating to what eyes do or what eyes need that have this piece in it. So for example, the verb to see has this in it. The word for eyeglasses has this in it. Things like that. Okay. Same kind of deal, different body part. Ear, yes. It's a very stylized right ear. Right? Very blocky looking. I'm sure it wasn't like this originally, but you can kind of see, okay, the cheek, the lobe, right? The part of the ear that sticks out, the crinkly cartilage parts on the inside. You can kind of see a little bit where they were coming from, right? And you've got to remember, this is a version that's much more modern. The ancient one looked more like an ear. But one of the things that was happening was, whoever the first shaman was to come up with this thing, wrote it his way. Other people, when they tried to copy it, they couldn't reproduce it exactly the same way he did, probably. So over time, somebody decided, you know what? I think it was one of the early emperors said, come on, you guys, we've got to standardize this nonsense. So that's kind of what happened very early on. Literally, like probably somewhere around 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, somebody started to standardize some of the characters, and they changed from the very rounded, more organic-looking pictures to something that was a little bit more blocky, more straight lines, something that was, one, easier to carve into your tortoise shell or your cow scapula or whatever you were using for divination, and two, It was easier for your apprentices and other people who were learning this system to learn how to reproduce it precisely, because it was somewhat standardized. So that's part of the reason why they all look sort of blocky these days instead of round and flowy. Another body part.
Foot.
Yes. You can kind of see it, right?
Yes.
Ankle bone, you know, the long foot bones that lead to your toes, the heel, you know, that one you can kind of see. And even if this part is missing or just has this line to it, this part of the character tends to have to do with feet and walking and things that feet do. So there are a number of characters that have, if not this whole thing, then that part in it. And a lot of them are things like run, walk, wake up, get up, you know, get out of bed kind of words. A lot of those have this piece. Anyone want to take a guess at this one? It looks like some kind of a house. It is money, yes. And the origin, think counting house, roof, right? Piles of gold bars and a floor. Can you kind of see that? So this is money. It also means gold specifically. And it is a radical that shows up in a slightly squished form. Like it'll be kind of squished to one side a little bit and slightly slanted. And that form tends to be the left-hand side of most of the words for common metals. So words like iron and steel and tin and whatever else, very often they have this. So, you know, if you were to look at a kanji version of the periodic table, a lot of the metallic elements would have this as a piece in their kanji.
Door.
Door, yes, door or gate, and it kind of looks like one, doesn't it? Kind of looks like saloon doors from the Old West. But if you look at like a traditional style of doorway in China or Japan, there's very often like a thick lintel up above, and then the posts that support it. So, door, and there are a lot of characters that use this as a component. Very often a pronunciation component. This is pronounced mon in Japanese, and there are a lot of words that are pronounced somewhere close. You know, mon, mon, gun, etc., etc. Some sort of a nasal sort of sound that have this as a component. And very often the extra piece, the meaning piece, will be in this little gap under here. So if you put ear in here, you've got listen. You put a little symbol that looks like an open gate in here, and it means to open. You put a different symbol under here, it means to close. Those are related concepts to doors, right? Open and close. You know, so that there are a lot of, you know, it's just another one of those that if you know it, it opens up at least half a dozen other characters that become easy to learn because you know that part already. This one.
Stairs?
No, that's a good guess. Looks more like stairs than what it actually means. What's that?
It looks like spears to me.
Spears, okay, yeah,
It kind of looks similar to a music chart or like
yeah.
a guitar thing.
I heard somebody else say something, but no. What says tweet tweet?
Bird.
Yeah, it's actually a short-tailed bird. Go figure. Again, this is one of the ones that's so stylized, it's changed so much that it's hard to see
You
it.
can kind of see it.
You can
like
kind of
if
see it
it's
a little
like
bit.
Two birds on
Okay.
a wire.
Yeah, two
Okay,
birds on
two
power
birds
line.
on a little wire,
Yeah, I think like
okay.
power lines.
Yeah, okay, birds on a power line, okay, maybe.
Yeah.
So at any rate, this is one of those ones that's sort of weird, like, why should I care? I mean, how often do you really need the word for sparrow in Japanese? But on the other hand, it's actually the component for a very important character that we're going to learn in lesson 4 in this semester. So don't lose this one. We'll be coming back to it next chapter, okay? Short-tailed bird.
Rain.
Rain, yeah, it kind of looks like rain on a window, doesn't it? Raindrops falling on a window. And so that's a nice, easy one. And rain is also a common component in a bunch of other characters, not just ones relating to weather, but also ones relating to electricity. You take this on top, you put a shape underneath that looks kind of like a kite. Electric. Think, Ben Franklin flying the kite in the rain, lightning hitting it, So this is the top half of electric, which then becomes part of compounds for things like electric conversation, which is the Japanese word for telephone, and, electric child, I think, is the combination for just electricity in general, and electric spirit, electric lights. Electric lake is a battery. So, very interesting. There are all kinds of combinations. And then rain itself is also part of words like cloud and snow and lightning and all that kind of stuff. Horse. Yes, horse. And again, this is one of those that has stylized itself so far that it doesn't look like a picture of a horse anymore. But you can kind of see the flowing mane here, right? Maybe that's the neck. Maybe those are the four hooves. Maybe that's like the tail. So you've got some horse parts in there. You don't have the whole horse anymore. What?
That's sad to think about.
Yeah. Well, it's only a drawing. They didn't cut up a real horse to make it.
Power.
Power, yes, as in strength and power. If this doesn't stick up all the way, you've got knife. So one way to think about this one is maybe the person with the knife has the power. That's, I don't know if that's historically accurate or not, but it's a good mnemonic, right? Also, some people feel like it looks a little bit like somebody doing like this, kind of upside down, but.
Bring a knife to a gunfight, yes, wouldn't it?
Yeah, what's that?
Bring a knife to a gunfight.
Right, yeah. So anyway, so that's power.
I was gonna make a pun, I'm not gonna say it.
What's that?
I was gonna make a pun, but I'm not gonna say it.
Okay. This one, anyone know?
Right hand.
Right hand, and it also is actually a standalone kanji that means again. It's pronounced mata. So if you hear like, ja, mata ne, see you again, this mata is the kanji they're talking about there. Okay, but it also means right hand when it shows up as a component in a whole slew of characters. There's got to be at least 2 dozen that use this.
Mouth.
Mouth, yes, mouth. And this, if I had to put a number on this one as a component, I would have to guess probably close to 100 characters use this in some way. It's very common.
So are mouth and enclosure the same? Because on one list they were, on another list they weren't.
Mouth and enclosure are actually the same basic shape, but they're 2 different components, and they do count as 2 separate radicals in most radical dictionaries. So if you're looking up a kanji by the way it looks, they count as 2 separate radicals.
But like, are they do you
Size
draw them
is-
the same?
Size difference is how you tell. If that's mouth, that's enclosure. So there's a little bit of a size difference. When you're writing this as a whole character, as a standalone character, in a phrase like exit, for example, it's still a little bit smaller than the character it's next to. It's got more white space around it. Whereas if you're writing this, it's always going to have something inside of it, for one thing. Enclosure as a radical does not exist as a standalone. You're never going to have a sentence in Japanese where it says, and then he built an enclosure and uses this character. Okay?
Never.
Never. But you will find a number of characters that have to do with borders, such as this one where this is country, kuni, koku, as in Chugoku, the Goku in Chugoku. It's also the Koku in Kankoku, those country names, and it means country. And it is an enclosure that represents like the borders of the country. And then on the inside, you've actually got a symbol that means king, and the extra little dot changes king to jade, as in this stuff. But, you know, why they picked that for the middle, good. Your guess is as good as mine, but that is, you know, so that's the difference between enclosure and mouth. Mouth can actually stand alone as just that box. The enclosure one does not have a standalone existence. It's always part of a character that happens to require an enclosure. So words like map, for example, have the enclosure and then other stuff inside. Okay, so that was mouth. Okay, this one is day or sun. Yeah, day, date, and sun, all of those. So it originated as a picture of a sun, which morphed into this over time. Okay, and then by extension, day and date, because those are abstract concepts. You can't really draw a picture of a day, but you can draw sun and say, well, you measure whether or not the day is finished by whether or not the sun is still up, right? So that kind of works, right? So that's why, depending on the context, this can mean either sun or day or date. Okay, and all of those do exist in Japanese, and they're usually very clear from context. Okay, kind of the same deal with this one. Moon, and again, this one evolved from a crescent moon shape with a couple of squiggly clouds floating across. Because if you drew it round, then how can you tell if it's moon or sun, right? But if it's crescent, it's clearly moon, because we don't usually see a crescent sun, right? Unless it's an eclipse, not an everyday occurrence. So crescent moon is what this evolved from, and it's important to note that just like with hiragana and katakana, we sometimes had ones that were similar looking, day or date, moon or month, and eye. Similar, but not the same. One line in the middle, then you close it. Two lines in the middle, and then you close it. Two lines in the middle, and the bottom is open. That's an important distinction. Also, when it comes to stroke order, all of these guys, all the boxy ones that have something inside the box, all follow the same basic pattern, which is first, you open the door. Then you invite your friends in. Then you close the door. Okay, so it doesn't matter whether it's an enclosure character or whether it's something like sun or moon or eye. Any of those characters that have that sort of rectangular shape with something in the middle, you always follow that basic rule of left side, top and right as a bent line, fill in the middle, and then close the bottom. Okay, and one of my professors some years ago used this little storyline of first you invite your friend, first you open your door, you let your friends come in, and then you close your door. That's how he described it. I thought that was a really good way to remember it, you know, because you open your front door first before your friends can come in your house, right? They don't crawl in through the window, you open the door for them, right? And then you don't shut the door in their face, you let them in first, right? You open the door and let them in. You don't open the door and shut it again, right? And then expect them to apparate through. So So that's a pretty good way to remember. That's a basic stroke order rule. The exception to that is when you've got a box and then something that cuts all the way through it, like kanji for middle, where you draw a little box and then you draw a line that goes all the way through. That means middle or center. Okay? And that is an exception because the line cuts all the way through. It doesn't stay within the box. Okay? Okay, so that's moon or month. It's part of the word for Monday. It's a literal moon, as in the moon in the sky, and it's also for the days, for the names of all the months, and for like the number of months, like, oh, he went for 3 months, that kind of stuff. It's for all of that. Tree, yes. Tree. And again, it's very stylized, but you can kind of see roots there and branches here. Okay, so it's a winter tree. No leaves. Oh well.
That's rice field.
Rice field, yes. And if you've ever seen actual rice fields, this actually does kind of look like it. These are like the earthen walls that are built around the edges, and then this is the space that gets all muddy where you grow the actual rice seedlings. Okay. So, and this follows the same basic rule. So, you know, first you open the door, then horizontal comes before vertical, and then you close the door. We talked about this one. Speak or speech, yes. Say, okay, and some people think that this looks like a mouth with like a speech bubble, like in a manga, or a mouth with like sound vibrations, like that the vibration symbol, successive lines, or if you've ever lived up north and experienced cold weather, the vapor that comes out of your mouth when you speak on a cold day. Some of you were looking at me like you've never heard of such a thing, but if you've ever lived where
I thought it looked like an apple, so.
Okay.
Doesn't help. I eat apples.
But you don't speak apples, so.
I know. So that doesn't help. I speak to the plants.
Okay, so anyone know what this one is? Kind of looks like they started off with an I, but it's a different word. These 2 little extra lines change it entirely. Anybody? That's a good guess, but no, it's not a nose. It's not a human body part. It's a little sea creature.
Is it a squid?
No, but that's a good guess too. It's a it's a shell. Yeah, it's a cowrie shell. Yeah. So, you know, if you're not sure which kind of shell I'm talking about, picture this, some little lines like that, and kind of like that shape.
Yeah.
It's one of those cylindrical looking shells that looks like a piece got rolled up, and there's a little critter that lives in there. And cowrie shells are one of those types of shells that have been used for decoration and for currency trade by prehistoric peoples all over the planet. So in addition to meaning shell, this symbol also actually does represent commerce or trade in a bunch of different characters. There are actually several characters that have this component that have to do with like business and buying and selling and such. Okay, so there are a number of characters that use this. Anybody remember this bottom half that we talked about? Foot. And this top half is actually soil, as in ground, so to walk or to run. Yeah, in Chinese this means walk, but in modern Japanese they actually use this kanji for run.
Is it actually separated though, or
There is,
is it just a line? Or is
it's
it-
actually 2 separate pieces, yeah. If you were writing this to 1, 2, 2, radical piece, and the top half is actually soil. And, you walk and run with your feet on the ground, so it kind of makes sense, although it's, if you wanted to take it really literally, you might be wondering why your feet are under the ground part. I think that was just an aesthetic choice, that it just looks like a more natural character construction that way. Reversing it would look really odd. Okay, so that's Hashiryu in Japanese, to run. This is enclosure, we talked about that. And soil, we just talked about that. And the origin of this one, by the way, was probably sprouts. Like these were the little leaves on a teeny little sprout that just poked its head up out of the soil. Because how do you draw a picture of soil and have anyone understand what the heck you meant by it, right?
That was soil, and what was the other one? That had that piece in it?
This is to walk or run,
Oh, okay.
but it's got soil as one component. It's got foot and soil, like putting your feet on the soil, and you walk or run, right? Make sense? This one, sunset. Think, there's your sun, and the sun's going down over a mountain maybe, right? So you're missing part of your sun. Okay, so this is actually sunset or evening or twilight, depending on which translation you look at for this symbol. Anyone? Close. Think about a little kid doing this. What are they probably saying? It was this big, right? Big, oki. It's also the dai in daigaku, great studies. Okay? So, yeah, it means big. Okay, this one? Anybody?
Woman?
Yes, this one is woman or female. And again, this one evolved from a picture that I can't really reproduce of a woman sitting in a traditional kneeling posture with her arms sort of inside of her sleeves in a traditional Chinese dress. So, not something that I can really show or demonstrate very easily, but you can sort of kind of maybe see the kneeling legs here, and the back here, and maybe these are the arms, like that. So, any of these that you're interested in finding out more about, if you look them up online, you can usually find like histories, renderings of the ancient form and some of the forms they evolved through.
It kind of looks like someone doing a curtsy.
Okay, yeah. If you can see some kind of a feminine figure in this, then use that as your mnemonic. That works. Some people think it looks like some of those old European fertility goddess things with the big wide hips. So, whatever works for you. And this one kind of goes with it because it's another human. Child, yes. So think baby with the legs and body all wrapped up in a blanket here, and their little arms are waving around, and a great big head proportioned to the body, because babies have big heads. Okay. This one I always thought looked sort of like a protractor, and it actually means it's a measurement, like a short length measurement, like around an inch or so. Obviously, it's not an actual literal inch, because that's an English measure, but this was a Chinese equivalent of an ancient inch. And this comes into play in one of the characters we're going to get very soon. Yes. Okay, this one?
Heart.
Yep, heart.
That's a lot different than
Yeah, well, it doesn't look any more or less like a human heart than the Valentine's one, right? You know, you can at least kind of see 1, 2, 3, 4 chambers, right? And if you look at an ancient drawing of the heart, I cannot reproduce it to save my life, but the ancient version of this character actually looks sort of like a sketch of a human heart. Like, you know, one of the ancient Chinese doctors actually did an autopsy on somebody and figured out what a human heart looked like. And drew it.
Like the,
You can kind of see like this,
the, well, not like a real heart, but it
Yeah.
does kind of resemble the whole,
yeah,
like, weird heart shape.
okay,
It looks like a turtle with this, like,
yeah.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
like, but if you rotate
Yeah.
it just a tiny bit, it looks like a heart, because it's got the two,
Okay.
actually see.
I see what you're saying, yeah. Well, and the other thing is, this is a stylized font.
Yeah.
It's very hard to find a font that reproduces the way people write it. Most of the time when people write it by hand, it looks more like that.
still looks like a face.
yeah, it looks like happy face.
Yeah,
And then like the other one's like a thumbs up.
Someone's happy
Yeah.
because their heart is still beating.
yeah. So, and then the other piece, this is a standalone heart. This is actually like, you know, kokoro. And this is a component that is supposed to mean heart, but it's a piece of a whole bunch of different characters that have to do with things like emotions very often. Okay, so when it's a component, as you see, I drew it to the side because it usually occurs on the left-hand side, and then there'll be some other piece over here, very often a piece that might have been a pronunciation component, except that it may or may not actually sound anything like that anymore, right? But, so you've got two versions of some of these characters, depending on whether they're recording as a component or as a standalone. Okay, this one? It looks like the letter I, yes. E. It looks like katakana e also. Anyone have any idea what it means? Actually, the letter I is a little bit of a clue. Think I-beam. Work, yes. Work or labor is what this means. And it kind of looks like an end-on view of an I-beam, which is used in construction. And since this term relates to that kind of work, physical labor, it kind of makes sense.
If you turn it sideways, it sort of looks like a dumbbell.
Okay, that's one way to think of it, yeah. Okay, so that's katakana e, but it also means work. Okay. Anybody? Any idea?
Small.
Small, tiny. Okay, and again, how do you draw a picture of tiny? It's an abstract concept, so they just had to come up with something. And again, this is sort of a stylized look at it. When people write it by hand, it looks more like that. It kind of looks like you started to write katakana mu, and then you changed your mind and wrote it further down and didn't erase the first one.
I mean, it kind of looks like something going like this.
Yeah, okay, yeah, it does kind of look like somebody doing like that, maybe with their other hand, you know, yeah, teeny tiny. So this means tiny. Okay. This one is one of the ones that's actually somewhat pictographic still.
Whoa.
Bow, yes. So if you've never done archery, you might not know about this, but there are very simple bows that are just like that. And then there are the recurved bows like that, right? Where this would be like a hand grip here, and then they have that double curve to them. I'm not very good at drawing it, but you can kind of see it there, right? There's your double curve with your handhold there. And this was one of the things that Chinese people did invent at some point. I'm not sure that they were the only ones to invent it, but they did invent it. So, so the recurved bow. So this is bow as in bow and arrow, and it's a component in a lot of characters having to do with things like strength. Okay. hand, yes. So again,
As opposed to.
very stylized, doesn't really look like much of a hand anymore, but you can kind of see where maybe this was the thumb and 1, 2, 3, 4 fingers, and there's your wrist. Sort of, kind of, maybe.
There's kanji for left hand, kanji for right hand.
Well, this is hand in general. The other one is specifically right hand, and I'm not sure why they have both, but they do. But this one is hand, and it occurs on its own as the word, the actual Japanese word for hand, and it's in a lot of compounds like tegami, hand, paper is actually a handwritten letter, and there, otearai is honorable hand washing, which is literally, a place to wash your hands. Otearai, washroom, restroom, bathroom. Some of the words for that. And then there are a zillion other phrases and idioms that use the word for hand, that use this kanji, and then you also have kanji that have this symbol on the side, which is a hand symbol. So for example, the word for hold, as in hold something, carry something, has this piece. Okay, so this one recurs a bunch of times and will come in really handy. No pun intended. Here we go again.
Small.
This one is small. So we have tiny, and we also have small.
So that one's like more extreme, like it's
Yeah,
smaller, and
it's
then that
even
one's.
tinier, and this one is just plain old small.
Oh, okay.
So it's an even bigger one.
Yeah. So and again, this one shows up in both compound words as a standalone kanji paired with other kanji, and it also shows up as a component within a variety of kanji. Okay, this one. Person, yes. And again, this is sort of a stylized font. When you write it by hand, usually the second line comes from slightly upwards of the midpoint of the first line, not all the way from the top. But that means person, and it's in phrases like Nihon jin, America jin. This is the jin kanji. Okay, that's jin. And so again, this is the standalone version, and sometimes it also shows up in this form within a kanji, and then it can also show up in this form on the left-hand side usually of a bunch of different kanji, some of which have to do with people and being human, and some of them are just things that take this radical for some reason, even if they're not especially related to people.
So if we say like someone who works at a bank, would it have labor and
Not
life
necessarily,
sciences
no,
attached to it?
not necessarily.
Okay.
Yeah, the word I'm thinking of for that doesn't even have either one of those in it.
Okay.
Knife?
Knife, yes, this is knife, and this is, again, a standalone piece, and it sometimes occurs in a character in this form, and then this is the alternate form of knife. And it generally shows up on the right-hand side, which is why I drew it that way in this card, because it doesn't necessarily show up on the left the way so many of the other skinny ones do. This is a skinny one that usually shows up on the right-hand side.
Is that by chance the kanji component that Lee was taken from, or possible?
Katakana ri, possible, I don't know for sure. You can look that up online too and maybe find out. Anyone know what this one's from? This one means?
Water?
Water, yes. This is water, mizu. Okay, and again, the origin of this one, the ancient form was something along the lines of 3 squiggles to show like running water in a stream or something. But then over time it got stylized. And when you write it by hand, you do the center line. This is actually a bent line, like a katakana fu. And then this slash and this slash actually count as separate lines, even though they sometimes get run together to the point where it's hard to tell that they're separated. So it often looks like this. I exaggerated the separations here so you could see them. But, yeah, that's how that one's normally written. So, and that also is an example of one of the basic rules, which is when you've got a center and two fairly symmetrical sides, you do center, then left, then right. And when you don't have that kind of construction, generally the rule is left to right, horizontal before vertical, top before bottom. Those are some of the rules for stroke order. Okay, so again, this is the standalone water, mizu, and it also occurs in a bunch of compounds and sometimes as a component. And then this is the 3-dot radical water, which generally shows up on your left-hand side of a character that has something to do with water. So a lot of the words for different kinds of liquids, like soy sauce and such, have this piece. I think oil has this, like, you know, liquid oil, like cooking oil, and a lot of other things like that. This one kind of looks like you combined katakana ni, which is also the kanji for the number 2, and chisai, small. But it actually means to show. Not sure why, I'm not sure where this originated from, but since it does have those two components that are recognizable, one way to remember it might be to think of like somebody having two little things in their hand that they want to show you. So 2 little things, let me show them to you. So that might be a way to remember it anyway. And so this is show, and then for whatever reason, katakana ne is actually the stylization of this for the left-hand side radical. Don't know why, but this turns into something that looks like katakana ne when it's a radical on the side. Go figure, right? So this one is the standalone kanji, and sometimes it occurs as a component also, and then this one is the left-hand side component. Anyone know this one? Mm-hmm. To eat, yes. And again, I don't know the origin of this one. I don't know if this was pictographic in some way in its original ancient form, but some people see like a roof like in a restaurant, and then a person with like a really big mouth shoveling food into their face with chopsticks.
Well, it kind of looks like a mustache over the mouth
Okay,
and then chopsticks under.
okay, a mustache over a mouth.
Like one of those like kind of cheesy ramen houses that are like wooden, sort of with like the chute in front.
Okay, yeah. So, different people see different things in this one. I don't know the historic underpinnings for it, so I can't really help you there. But if anyone wants to look it up, I would be curious to know what this actually evolved from. But at any rate, and this is one example of one that gets squished to the side, and it actually loses one little stroke when it's the left-hand side radical. Some characters, when they get squished to the side for their left-hand version, they don't really lose anything, they just get squished. This one gets squished and loses a line. Okay, so that's, and this, besides meaning to eat and showing up in compound words like shokudo, dining hall, it also is a piece of words like nomimasu, to drink, gohan, a meal, also cooked rice, and a variety of other characters that have to do with ingesting nutrition. Okay, this is the side piece of this. This one looks a little bit like,
Is that clothing?
yeah, it looks a little bit like a kimono top or something, you know, a wrap shirt, and that's where it actually did originate from. It's basically, if you know what a kimono looks like, it kind of looks like that, like a shirt that's wrapped. That was what the original of this ancient character looks like, and it means clothing as a sort of general concept. And again, the radical looks a lot like the one for to show, but it's got one extra line to it, besides the katakana ne looking part. And so it's sort of a stylized version of this. And again, a lot of terms that have to do with cloth or clothing, and other terms that don't seem all that closely related sometimes have this component. So it's in a lot of things. Yeah.
Will we ever see multiple of the side kanji used
In the same
single
character?
kanji?
So it can happen. It can happen. It's not too common, but it can happen.
It looks kind of like when like the kimono are on like a stand. If you think, like,
Yeah,
the bottom
when it's
two
spread
strokes.
out.
If you
Yeah.
think like the bottom two strokes are like the stand and like.
Okay,
Like a
yeah.
frame?
Yeah, they make these kimono frames that are literally for displaying a kimono, and it's like a big top cross piece and a couple of supports like this, and then a base, and then the sleeves of the kimono go on the top bar. And sometimes there are clips that they use to like open out the two sides of it so you can see the inner lining, and those get attached to the side support pieces. Okay, so this one, you remember the top part was tiny and the bottom part was small. And the combination, something that's really, really tiny and small, is fine silk. Think like threads of silk. Doesn't get much finer than that. When you're talking about actual authentic silk off of a silkworm cocoon, that's pretty fine stuff. It's almost like spider web fine. So that's what this one means, fine silk. And this is the side piece version of it, which again occurs in a lot of terms that have to do with smallness or detail. So like komakai, which means small or detailed, has this piece in it. Okay. And our last pairing, we've got fire. It kind of looks like you've built a little stick teepee and set it ablaze, right? You know, you can kind of see the flames coming off the little teepee of twigs. And this is more like the aftermath, the embers, the coals at the bottom underneath something.
You know, sit underneath another kanji.
Yeah, this would sit underneath a kanji. For example, the word for something that's hot to the touch, like a stove, has this piece underneath. The word for the color black has this piece. You know, think, you know, cooking something so it's soot blackened, you know, so the color black has it. And a variety of other things have this piece, and most of them have something to do with fire or cooking.
Didn't fish have it?
Fish has it, but from a different origin. Yeah, 'cause it's not talking about cooking the fish, actually. Fish, I believe, counts as a radical all on its own. And even though it looks like it's composed of this component, and this component, it actually, I think, counts as its own radical that occurs in a lot of words that have to do with seafood, for example. You'll see it as a side piece with something else over here, and it's in words like fresh, because that's one thing you really want in your seafood, right? And it's in words for a lot of different types of seafood, which Japan has lots of. They probably have more variety of seafood dishes than almost anyone.
So do you want us to be memorizing like certain pronunciations of these?
For
or
now,
just the
I'm
meaning?
asking you just to know the meanings and how to write them, because the pronunciations that are in that worksheet that's online don't correspond to anything in Japanese. That's actually from a Chinese textbook. So don't worry about those pronunciations at all, okay? But I do want you to be able to read and write them well enough so that when you see a character that, for example, has rain in it, you have an idea, oh yeah, that part means rain, so this might have something to do with the weather, or maybe electricity, since so many of the electric ones also have rain in them. Okay, so that's what I want for you to be able to look at, especially the characters that we're going to be studying the next couple chapters, but then also going forward, anytime you're trying to read something in Japanese and you come across a kanji you've never seen before, if you know what the components are, or even some of the components, and you know what some of the surrounding words mean, that's context clues. That's the equivalent of coming across an SAT word you've never encountered, but because you know what the rest of the sentence is saying, and you know what some of the Latin or Greek roots and prefixes and suffixes are, that you can actually decipher that word you've never seen before in your life, with some hope that you're actually pretty close to the right meaning, right? You can do the same thing with kanji in context if you know the rest of the sentence and the kanji that you've never seen before is made up of components that you have encountered. And I'll give you one example from, we've got a few minutes left. So I'll give you one example from our chapter that we're about to get into. Okay, so who remembers what this piece is? Sun. Who remembers what this piece is?
Soil.
Soil. Who remembers what this piece is? Inch. Okay? So you put them together, the sun shining down on the soil, which has been divided into measured increments around a stick. And what have you got?
Time.
Basic sundial, right? Can you picture that? You know, you've got a stick in the ground, you've got your measurements around the stick, you've got the sun shining down on it, right? Making a shadow that tells you what time it is, right? Can you picture that? The Chinese were one of the cultures that invented sundials pretty far back. And they also had time candles that kept track of how, you know, how much time had passed based on, you know, having, ancient Japan had them too, where the candle was like marked at different spots. And so when it burned down to a certain place, you knew that a certain amount of time had passed. But this is the Ji, as in Ichiji, 1 o'clock. And it's literally like practically a picture of a sundial. Sun, soil, time increment, measurement increment, inch, right? Cool, right? So that's an example of if you had never seen this kanji before, but you knew what all these meant, and you saw it in context in a sentence where you could understand everything else, you might actually be able to figure out what that meant. Right? If you had no idea what any of those components were, you'd have no hope, right? And over time, as you learn more kanji, you will find more and more places where, oh, I recognize that piece, but that other piece is different. Okay, so it doesn't mean this one because that's one character and this is a slightly different character, but maybe it means something related. Or maybe it's pronounced similar, and then you can look at your context and see if maybe you can decipher what it is from the context clues, right? You know, so just to give you another example of characters that look alike, this is G, right? O'clock. You remember what this one is? Anybody? Hand. This is the side version of hand. You put that against the same right-hand side. It's a verb that means to hold or to carry. Okay? You take it away and you have just soil and inch. That's a Buddhist temple. Okay, so right now, just from that, you've got 3 different characters that look similar to one another, but because you already know one, these are going to be easier to learn. You know, you put a double person radical. This is like 2 people standing next to each other radical. Wait, matsu, mate, mate kudasai. Remember that one? Chotto mate. So it's like 2 people, and they're waiting. So, yeah, they're standing there on the soil, looking at the watches. What the heck is taking our third friend so long to get here? You know? So can you see how, once you know one piece, related kanji become easier to learn, right?
The one referring to Buddhist temple, is that referring to the towers? I can't remember what they're called.
The pagoda, that may very well be where that kanji originated.
But it's in general just referring specifically to a temple?
Yeah, in Japanese the word is opera, which means the whole temple complex, not just the pagoda. The pagoda is usually one building within a larger temple complex. You know, usually there'll be like a prayer hall. Sometimes there's a pagoda, sometimes there isn't. And then, you know, if it's a residential temple, quarters for the monks and such. Okay. So, but do you see what I'm talking about? That there are multiple characters that use a certain component. So if you know certain components, you've got building blocks to help you learn characters. So when you start looking at something like this one, instead of seeing lots of random lines and chaos, you can pick it apart and say, well, okay, there's sun, right? There's that short-tailed bird crazy thing, right? And then, oh, katakana yo twice, right? And you put the whole thing together, it's pronounced yo, and it's part of the word for days of the week. And so this is kind of like a pronunciation clue, right? Yo-yo, but it's pronounced yo, right? Like that. But it's in all 7 days of the week. The names for all 7 days of the week include this character. Isn't it much easier to learn this, this, and this, rather than 16 random lines or whatever that is? Right? So learning your components, learning your radicals is going to help you master the kanji going forward. And the other good news is if you were to just learn the 500 most commonly used kanji, they say that with just that much you can be able to understand and read like 90% of what's published in Japan. There are something like 2,000 characters that are considered the cutoff for literacy, but the first 500 of those, if they're listed in order of most commonly used, the first 500 of those are the most important ones. The other 1,500, if you haven't learned them yet, you can still get by. And once you've learned that many, learning new ones becomes a lot easier. It's got a snowball effect, because you know the first few you learn, they feel really difficult and challenging, but then you learn more that combine things you've already learned before with the things you're learning now, and all of a sudden, you know, oh, look, I learned mountain yesterday, and now look, this has mountain in it. Volcano has mountain in it. This other word has mountain in it. This other word has mountain in it. Wow. You know? So, question?
Is there like standardized order to learning the kanji, or sometimes in just glancing over JLPT study guides, it'll be divided into levels or numerical
Yeah.
things.
They have done, I think the JLPT and other resources like that have sort of done a linguistic analysis of Japanese, and they're the ones who've determined, okay, these are the most commonly used characters, and you can find workbooks on the market that actually list them in order, like most commonly used, second most commonly used, third most commonly used, fourth most commonly used. It's not quite the same as the order that our textbook teaches, but it's close. Our textbook, I think, for the most part, stuck to that most commonly used structure, but they shuffled them a little bit to accommodate what they felt like they wanted to teach in a given lesson in terms of vocabulary and grammar also, so that at least some of the time what you were learning in kanji would sort of match up with what they were teaching you in the rest of that lesson. But like this chapter, they start us off with all the numbers, and G and yen, N, because we already know how to count and do numbers. So if they give you ichi to ju, and then kyakusen and man, now you can write all those prices and phone numbers and clock times in kanji. So they gave you that all as one set, so that you wouldn't be like, well, I learned how to write most of these numbers, but how come I can't write sen and man in kanji yet, right? So they just gave you all of them at once, because it's kind of a logical grouping. Even though technically in terms of like common usage, the hito kanji, jin, should have been in there like right after 1, 2, and 3 or something. Okay, but they just saved that for lesson 4. Okay, but there are workbooks on the market if you're looking for like extra practice or something. There are workbooks on the market that do teach them in order. I think Charles E. Tuttle, Tuttle, is one of the companies that I think has a workbook for kanji that teaches like the first 500 most commonly used. We're not going to get nearly that far this semester. I think we're going to learn around 28 or 30 this semester. But considering we did all the hiragana and katakana, I feel like that's good enough for now. You know, and second semester we'll get again around 12 to 15 per chapter. So, you know, this book takes kanji a little bit slowly compared to some kanji books. But don't forget, you've got the option. Remember, I'm saying it's an option of learning some of these if you want to. These are all optional. The only ones that are required in every chapter for this textbook are the ones that are taught back here. So we're going into lesson 3. The kanji that you are expected to know for this next chapter test will be these guys. Okay, and I want you to know the radicals to help you learn these, most especially this one. But the radicals are more to help you going forward, not so much for this lesson specifically. But, you know, look, there's yo, and there's, look, moon, sun, fire, water, tree, gold. They're all in here. So if you've already studied them some, then when we get to lesson 4, this becomes really easy because most of the ones that are in here we've already covered. Okay? So any questions about that? I think we're pretty much out of time, but so that's what I wanted to do today, was just basically go over the kanji. We will start lesson 3, formal content, next class.
So Sensei, did you learn Chinese before